he wasn't really being influential in the discourse the way he was when he was backed by a larger media property. Um, it's somewhat analogous to Glenn Beck, leaving Fox and having his own Blaze empire. I think the Blaze is probably more successful than what Sullivan was doing by himself, because the Blaze has a whole bunch of, it has space on cable TV and, syndicated radio program and whatnot. But it still sort of lives in its own universe. It doesn't necessarily seem to bleed out into the broader
Howard
discourse.
Stern, another example would be Howard Stern.
Yes.
I mean, I'm sure he probably makes more money on satellite radio, but I think he was probably more relevant to the culture when he was on terrestrial radio.
Right. And Howard had a fat paycheck from SiriusXM that actually sustains that operation, whether it gets ratings or not. It was a very long term contract, because he essentially props up that entire subscriber base. Andrew Sullivan was just Andrew Sullivan. Tempo. I wondered, he spun it as, I want to, sort of unplug, and I want to read more, and I want to enjoy the real world, and kind of tossed out there, I want to write a book, which just maybe he already has a book deal in his back pocket that he needs to work on. But it struck me as being more a implicit admission of failure, that totally going it alone, is probably not sustainable if you want to be at the level of influence that he was at before.
Well, okay, so I took him at face value that what he was saying is true. And look, I mean, people who it's hard to complain and bitch about getting paid to blog and getting paid to write, but there's this story. Tony Kornheiser, people come up to him and they say, I think I could do a radio show. I could do a sports radio show. And he says, I bet you could. I bet you could come in on Monday after a football Sunday, and you could have a pretty good show. You might even do better than me. And I bet you could come in on Tuesday, and you could probably have a pretty good show. Well, what's your Thursday show going to be? Because by then the adrenaline is worn off. And what are you going to talk about then? How's your Thursday show going to be? And so I think there's a connection here. I mean, you try for 15 years putting up 10 to 15 blog posts a day. Even if you're just curating stuff, you still have to know enough to know what to curate, and he was brilliant at it. You're essentially tethered to the blog, and it becomes very difficult to be weighing in on everything that happens multiple times a day and still be kind of replenishing your soul, reading, interviewing people, talking to people, taking vacations. Sullivan managed to do some of that stuff, of course, but it's difficult.
I think it's what New York Magazine pointed out, that he did quit blogging 10 years ago.
This is not the first time.
He's found ways to take a step back and work on bigger projects and come back in, and it's very possible he'll do the same thing again here. Very much like a musician, retiring, only to have a big comeback, later on.
And he has people. I mean, he has lots of people. Unlike me, for example, we had lots of people who help him, who like interns and guest bloggers.
They had a 10-person staff.
Yeah. And I think that's part of his deal when he went to like some of these outlets, that they would, people like Connor Friedersdorf, who's here at the Blogging Heads, I think for a while worked for him in that capacity of, So look, I think that this is something that bloggers struggle with. So I think there's a bigger story here. Newt Gingrich tells this parable about field mice and antelope, and he says, a lion could theoretically survive by chasing, catching, killing, and eating field mice, but he would also eventually starve to death. What a lion needs to do is catch some antelope. And it's harder and it takes more time, but that's what will nourish a lion. And I think that, in this analogy, a lot of writers and bloggers are chasing field mice, these little stories of the day that are timely. that give you that little buzz, that little like sugar rush of, wow, I just wrote something, I just tweeted it. But it's not the same as reading a long book or writing a book that might have some permanence and some long-term importance.